Hello, convention friends. This is Reverend Anna Woofenden, and this session is titled Finding Church Beyond the Walls, Reimagining Church in the Time of COVID. So as some of you know, and others may not, part of my background is that I am the founder of the Garden Church in Los Angeles, California. And the Garden Church, we took an empty lot and turned it into an urban farm and an outdoor sanctuary where we reimagined church as we worked together and worshiped together and ate together. And through that time and that process, and that church continues to live and strong under the leadership of Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mitchell and Reverend Dr. Amanda Riley. And so they continue to be reimagining what church would look like, what church can look like, what church does look like. And so what I want to explore today is some of the principles about reimagining church in general that might apply to our time of reimagining church during the time of COVID. I just published a book called This is God's Table, Finding Church Beyond the Walls. And it came out in the middle of April. And this question quickly emerged of what is this book about? An outdoor sanctuary where you're getting your hands in the dirt, where you're being in community with one another, where you're gathering around God's table. What does that have to say to a conversation where now our churches are meeting virtually and where we can't actually physically gather together? And it's offered me this opportunity to really reflect on how do we reimagine church without some of the ways that we are used to connecting. It's not just that our church is beyond the walls in terms of not in our traditional buildings and sanctuaries. It's that we are all in different walls in our homes, or for those who don't have homes, in shelters and outdoors. What does it look like to be the gathered body of church when we are not physically able to be together? And so what I want to explore today are just a few ideas of how I and others have been thinking through this question of what does it look like to reimagine church? And many of you who are watching have, I'm sure, many ideas yourselves. So these are not this is the way to do church during COVID, but just some stories and some thoughts about how we can navigate and how we can think on these questions together. So the first principle or idea that I want to offer is that the church is not the building. This is one of the lessons that I continually appreciated at the Garden Church. One of my favorite things was when people would walk in through the front gates. So this is an empty lot that was turned into this urban farm outdoor sanctuary, or gates out front, sidewalk, people walking by, and big sign out front that says the Garden Church. And people would walk in and say, "This is the Garden Church. Where's the church?" And then we'd say, "Well, you're in the church." And then we'll say, no, well, where's the church? And I kind of got a kick out of this, so I usually went maybe another round. "Well, you're in the church." No, where's the church? And I said, wait, so well, this is our sanctuary. It's on Sunday afternoon. We work together and worship together and eat together, and this is our outdoor sanctuary. But people were looking for the church as a building, right? The church is a physical place. But we know, and we, in our Swedenborgian theology, can think about and know that church is not our buildings. This does not mean our buildings are not important and beautiful and sacred and serve good purpose, but the church is the people. The church is people gathering together to love God and to love neighbor together. The church exists on these many layers and in concentric circles and levels, and the church is alive and well whether we are in our physical buildings or not. When we remember that the church is not the building, then it's not a question of that the church is closed because our building is closed. It's an opportunity for an invitation to ask, okay, so many of us are used to being the church within a particular context of our buildings. And again, that's not a bad thing. That is what we've had. But all of a sudden, we've all been thrust into this world where we're trying to be church beyond the walls. And so how does continuing to remember that we are open, the church is open, even when our buildings are closed, how does that invite us into discovering what it means to be church together. Which this leads me to my second thought and point, and that is about context. So context matters. Context is an important piece of this conversation. So when I started the Garden Church, a group of us, our founding board members, some of which who are people that you know well, and then founding members in the community, we spent 3-4 months walking the streets of our neighborhoods. And we were looking for things. We were looking for things like, where are the empty lots? Where are the access to food? Where are the elementary schools? And where are people living? And where are the homeless encampments? And where are different kinds of homes? And we were getting to know, what are the needs of our community? What is our context? We're especially looking in that particular context about food insecurity and food access, and that was part of our particular conversation. When we started the Garden Church, it was in an area and a neighborhood that we knew needed fresh fruit and vegetables, but it also needed a place where people from different economic classes, different backgrounds, different walks of life could come together and be in community together. So that was part of our context. Now, what is really interesting to me about this question of context is that each one of you could do that walk in your own neighborhood. And I recommend that you do. I think that there's something really powerful about walking in the neighborhood of where our churches are and seeing who are the people and what are the needs. And that context actually still matters for all of us, that physical context of where our churches are located. But there's another context that we've all been thrown into, and this is the context of virtual worship, virtual connection, being connected in these ways. You are watching a video that is uploaded onto a website. You're in your home, probably, maybe watching a computer, iPad, phone. I'm recording it in my home on a Zoom meeting. This is a different context. What I've been encouraging pastors and churches to think about, and I invite to think about, is how do those two contexts intersect? Because right now, you can go to worship a lot of different places online, but they're still different because of their context. Context matters in that our congregations have different personalities and cultures. Context matters because we are serving different groups of people. Context matters because we're from different traditions. We have different ways that we are used to coming together. And so that it is less about what medium are you using for your technology and more about thinking about who are the people. Again, if the church is the people, the gathered body, in whatever way we're gathering, how are we working our worship services and being church as a whole into our various contexts? The context question is one that I think can then invite us into an exploration and a question about our patterns of worship. One of the pieces that I think has been really interesting to see is how we adjust our patterns of worship to be done virtually. Now, the Garden Church has shifted its patterns of worship. It used to be on a Sunday afternoon that at about 2:30, people would get there and start setting up for the work together time. There'd be things that were happening in the garden, maybe art projects, there would be snacks or water be set up. And then at 3 o'clock, there'd be time to work together in the garden and physically get your hands in the soil and be in community together. Then at 4 o'clock, we'll go through a worship service. And the worship service, from the gathering song and the invocation, all the way through with preaching and prayers and reflection, passing the peace, and then taking Holy Communion together, we'd wash our hands and then move into a big community meal. After the community meal, where everyone would sit down together and we'd come back together in a circle and be in and this closing circle with anointing and blessing and prayer, and this exercise of noticing, where did you experience the presence of God? Now, that's what it looked like pre-COVID. Now, under the leadership of Reverend Jonathan and Reverend Amanda, they've shifted what that pattern of worship looks like. But you'll notice there are distinct marking points that continue. So the church now gathers a little earlier because the work together happens in different people's homes. It happens during the week when a few volunteers come in to garden. It happens as people are making food and meals in their homes to then be distributed. Because of the time and the distribution of the community meal, which I'll get to in a minute, they've actually moved their worship service a little earlier. And it happens virtually. It happens on Zoom. I had the honor of getting to be part of that service last month for the 5-year anniversary. And I was so struck and moved by how the movements of the service translated into this virtual realm and the way that Reverend Jonathan and Reverend Amanda have created that. And so people gather together on Zoom because one of the things about the Garden Church's context is that people are used to being in a circle to see one another's faces. Did you ever notice if you're in a church that's kind of a traditionally shaped church with pews that are all facing the front, right? That you see the faces of the people up front. Usually they're people that, have a clergy collar on, or maybe they're readers or musicians. But mostly the people that you are in community with, you see the back of their heads, or they see the back of your head. One of the things that we were very purposeful about at the Garden Church as we were reimagining church and church space was to make a sanctuary that was more circular. So yes, you could see the pastor, the preacher, the readers, but you also were looking at the faces of one another. And part of that is replicated strangely on Zoom. We're all hearing about the Zoom fatigue, right? Which I hear it, experience it. And there are experts who are telling us that actually it takes more energy because we are seeing everyone's faces and we are noticing their expressions and we are taking in their background from behind them. And it's interesting to me because while too much of that obviously does make us fatigued, and I'm all for maybe fewer Zoom meetings, but there's something really powerful about that as well, which means that while we are in worship in that particular context, if you're using that medium of Zoom, we are seeing the faces of the community that we are worshiping with. We are experiencing one another and responding to one another. Now, as a pastor, as a minister, as a preacher, this is something that we count on in regular old church and worship time, is that interaction, looking out. Are people getting it? Are they with me? Are they not with me? Now, this is not a gift that many of us have right now as we are leading worship. Right? One of the contexts that I am preaching in regularly, they have decided to do streaming to Facebook Live, which works well for that particular congregation. But what it means is that I do exactly what I'm doing right now, which is I am talking to a camera. And I have no idea really how well it's going on the other side and how people are responding. So, but to circle back to context and to those patterns of worship. So the Garden Church, there is this value of seeing one another and of looking across the circle. It's part of the invocation, kind of look across the circle into one another's eyes and see that spark of the divine in all people. And that's something that actually you can do on Zoom. And I would encourage you that whether you're in a worship setting or not, maybe one of the ways to kind of transform some of that Zoom fatigue is to look into those faces and just try to see that spark of the divine in other people. To see, I have the gift of contemplating these other human beings. How is God working through them? How can I listen to God's voice in them? So that's the first piece. Then in the Garden Church's worship, it is highly participatory. This is one of the values of the Garden Church and the worship there. And this continues within the worship experience. Reverend Jonathan and Reverend Amanda continue to have various people read, various people lead music for the worship. and to have time during the discussion time after the sermon and prayer time for various people to unmute themselves and be able to share. In a different context, I was talking to a pastor today who said that they have people who are joining their worship service from all over the country. Her parents, her in-laws are all jumping on that Zoom call to be part of a congregation that some of whom they've never met. And that her parishioners, her congregants, regular people who would be there on a Sunday morning are loving getting to know a whole new group of people. So there are invitations and there are opportunities in this time as well for us to include and up participation. Now, for some of you, you might not be doing a live Zoom call. Maybe they're recording something. I'm seeing so many creative things happening. You know, the Swedenborg Chapel, under the leadership of Reverend Sage Cole, having people send in little videos, and those are being included in the worship. That some of the lay leaders are leading, that musicians are recording in their own homes. There are different ways that we can remember this value of participation and having various people involved in these experiences. But back to the garden church pattern of worship. Participation. And then there's this opportunity for sharing in Holy Communion together. The same prayers are prayed, that remembering, that echoing back of the prayers that people are used to and are craving, that togetherness and that connection. And then they go straight into this exercise at the end of noticing where God is and then blessing each person. Now this, if you're doing a worship experience on Zoom, this is the piece that I want to say, maybe this is my most important point, is I think one of the things that many of us are missing is that moment of intimate connection with another human being that often happens during Holy Communion, maybe during the passing of the peace, that moment where we look into one of each other's eyes and are witnessed and seen. And so I was really just so touched at the Garden Church to find that they are doing this practice. It's a practice I also have been doing with the Amherst College students at dinner church. And it's a practice that I am hearing people who are gathering for worship on Zoom longing for. And that is to actually go around the screen and give individual blessings by name. And so, for example, at Amherst College Dinner Church, I would say, beloved child of God, you are loved by God. That's not what I would say. I forget, what did I say? I would say, for example, Julia, beloved child of God, you belong to God, we belong to one another, and you are loved. And I try to look right into the camera and reach out through the miles, through the screen, to make that connection between people. It's not the same. And that's one of the things that I think we have to keep remembering. It's not the same, and we don't all love it, because wouldn't it be nice to be able to be back in person again? And yet there is an invitation, an opportunity to be able to connect in these ways, to be able to have that back and forth. Now, after at the Garden Church in their virtual liturgy, after the blessing, what happens then is that whoever's day it was to be down in the garden, one of the two pastors, then they lead everyone in the singing of the blessing song, that there is enough, there's enough, there's enough and some to share. Because what then starts to happen is whoever is the volunteer or two for that day bring in the food. It's all packaged up, all safely packaged in individual servings. Sometimes local restaurants are bringing it and just one or two people are there to distribute it safely. But the feeding continues, because that was a mark of that particular community, was to feed, is to feed. And so what are those things in your community and in your pattern of worship? To think about, what are the things that make your congregation your congregation? Are there pieces within the service that are said every week? Are there things that your church does as a church that have to be creatively switched and changed and tweaked, but that you are continuing to do to think about how do those patterns of worship continue. The next point that I want to explore is that people crave connection. There's a lot of good content out there, and I think there's a place for good content. There is a place for good preaching, and we need it. And we need to continue to do it. But people also crave connection. So what are the ways in our various contexts that we are creating and even upping the connection when we are physically not able to gather? I've heard wonderful stories about phone calls, letters being written, about small groups forming to touch base and check in with each other at least once a week. There are things happening in our very own denomination. Reverend Susanna Curry, the chair of our Council of Ministers, has been gathering together clergy every Sunday night. There are specific groups that are forming. There are studies. SwedenborgCommunity.org is gathering people together. There are so many opportunities all of a sudden to actually gather with people that we often don't see except for, let's say, at convention or at one of our camps. So how do we up the connection? For example, there are Sparks games from Freiburg being led on a, I think, weekly basis by my Uncle Trevor Woofenden. There are different creative ways that people are being brought together. Here we are having a virtual convention. So how do we feed this craving for connection while we are physically distanced? I was talking to a congregation member this morning, and she was saying, what I'm finding is this is an invitation for creativity. And that's what I think we are seeing, and that I would encourage us to continue to live in is, how do we be creative? How do we think outside the box, outside the walls, in creative ways of how can we connect? I think we see this in neighborhoods too, right? And we see this in communities in different ways. Just yesterday, I had this wonderful interaction with someone that I know from church, and I've only honestly met her a few times, but we became friends on Facebook, and then, you kind of get an eye on each other's lives a bit. And she had put a post on Facebook that she'd done some delivery of little mint plants from her garden to some friends and neighbors. And I, as I'm putting in my little back porch garden, said, "Oh, if you ever coming over to Northampton, I'd be happy to receive some mint plant if you have any more." And she wrote right back, and yes, she did. And I had some squash starts, and we had a lovely little front porch exchange that honestly wouldn't have happened necessarily otherwise. It's an example, might sound silly, but to me, it was this moment of connection. And we both went a little bit the extra mile for that connection. And yet, there was something so beautiful in it. So this is an opportunity for creativity around how we can engage and connect. As we're seeing how all of this unfolds and plays out, it is looking like we may not be safely together fully in our buildings for maybe quite a long time. That church will continue to be some hybrid of virtual and maybe smaller groups in person. Who knows? It's different state to state. And I, for one, know that I strive for us to err on this side of caution and health and the well-being of our communities. And so rather than just kind of waiting it out, which I think early on a lot of us were like, well, let's wait this out. Instead, I invite us, and I keep inviting myself to turn towards that creativity and to think, how can we connect? It's summer. Maybe a few small groups can meet in a backyard and watch your Sunday worship service together. Maybe sometimes if you're looking for a little extra connection, that pick up the phone. Have that Zoom or FaceTime or whatever it is. And that as a church, that we remember that we are church even when we're not in our buildings and even during the week, and that we care for one another by reaching out. Another piece of all of this that I want to bring forward is the importance of of rest and the importance of Sabbath. I have here today a piece of art that I made a number of years ago, which is inspired by a piece of art by Hildegard of Bingen. And you can look it up her original piece. It's beautiful. This is a very simple, sort of inspired by. But it has this cycle of the tree of life. And it has different people who are doing different things. Some are working and plowing. Some are praying. And others are resting. Even this one is taking a nap. And this is an image for me that reminds me of that cycle of life and that cycle of creation and that cycle of Sabbath. And that we know that on the seventh day, God rested. And as Swedenborgians, we can hearken to the depth of those passages in Genesis as they are expounded upon in Secrets of Heaven about this cycle of creation being our own inner spiritual cycle and our path of generation or spiritual growth. And that part of that is Sabbath. And the thing about that cycle of creation is that it has this eternal, lifelong and eternity-long cycle. And it has a weekly cycle. And it even has a daily cycle and a minute-to-minute cycle. And that we keep living in that. And that part of that is creation and being creative. And I've been talking about all these creative ways that we can be church in this time. But as we are being creative, expelling energy, investing, we also need to rest. Friends, I don't know about you. Everyone's in a different situation, but I have not found that this has been a restful time. There was, and I think it depends on all of our different situations, but I know especially early on, there was a little bit of like, oh, it's like a vacation, a snow day. It's a time to read all those books maybe you meant to read. And that may be some of your experience. And I'm glad for you in that. That has not been my experience. I know it's not the experience of many. And so how in a time where we are needing to be more creative, we are needing to be more cautious, we are needing to expel energy. Some of you are parenting children and working from home. Others are figuring out how do you get groceries and food. There are so many ways that we are being called to be creative and to give energy. How in that do we find rest? And that time for rest. And so that is one of the invitations, and that's one of the reminders that our churches and our spiritual lives can give us, is that in and amongst all that we are doing, we still need to rest. Maybe for you, if you were a member of a congregation that Sunday worship was part of that rest, that Sabbath for you. And maybe you are watching it online and that's something, but it's not quite the same as that whole morning that you would dedicate to going to church, having that connection. So what are those other ways that you are resting? Ways that are resting that are life-giving and renewing. Is it getting out in the garden, going on a walk, doing some art, reading a book, taking a nap? What are the ways that you are renewing yourself and letting God renew you in this time? Because frankly, it's wearing and it's exhausting and it's something we're in for the long haul. So how do we continue to renew one another and ourselves and rest? And then finally, I want to offer the reminder and the invitation that we find in the book of Micah to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with God. This time of pandemic has shown us so many cracks in our systems. It has shown us really that apocalypse, that revealing, that tearing back and peeling back to see where are the broken places. As we know, there are so many in our country, in our world, who are suffering at greater lengths because of the health and the economics that have happened in this pandemic. And as a church, that is part of our call as well, is to have our eyes open and to be awake. Why do we need to rest and take Sabbath? So that we can be awake to those needs in our communities and in the world around us. So that as churches, that we are looking and seeing how can we be part of those healing leaves we hear about in the end of the book of Revelation with the tree of life, those leaves of justice and mercy, the leaves of compassion and reconciliation and hope. And so that we as churches, not only are we open to love God and love neighbor as we worship together, as we connect with one another, as we creatively gather in these different ways, that we are also continue to be called to be the church as we serve and as we work for justice, as we are merciful because God loves mercy. What are the ways that we are creatively and safely advocating for those who are struggling, striving to alleviate pain and suffering, hunger and poverty? What are the ways that we individually and collectively are being of use in our world? Because as we know, that is one of the marks of us as church, is that we are loving God and loving our neighbor. And yes, our neighbors that we are used to seeing in the pews, but also those neighbors that live down the street or in the town over or in the next state or around the globe. That these acts of being church extend beyond the walls as we work together to create that more just and generous world. That blessing song at the Garden Church comes to mind. There is enough, there is enough, there is enough, and some to share. This is something that I think in the time of pandemic we need to remember even more, when hoarding and scarcity and legitimate fear for and care for our own well-being and the well-being of our households and our families, that in that we are also mindful of what we have and what we can share, how we can give and love and serve one another. And so, friends, as we continue to walk through this season that is new to all of us, none of us, I don't think any of you, if you have, let me know, but I certainly have not ministered or been part of a church through a global pandemic before. We are all being called to be creative. We are all being called to figure out new ways to connect. We're being called to rest, and we are being called to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly. So as each of you, as we all go about this work, may we remember that we are not alone. We do not do this work alone, and that we are filled with that influx of the divine, that the Lord God is with us and is guiding us on the way. Blessings, friends.
Good afternoon, and welcome to our Q&A on the lecture on Finding Church Beyond the Walls, Reimagining Church in the Time of COVID with Reverend Anna Woofenden. Reverend Anna, I want to welcome you. And also want to thank you for expounding on the journey of the creation of the Garden Church. It's something that I'm sure many of us wanted to hear about, as we know about it from a distance, but not up close and personal. One of the stories that was shared in the comments that I wanted to lift up for you to respond to was the image of Amanda praying through the gate. And one of the questions that was asked is, what are some of the ways that we can be of use and create human connection with the restrictions that we have on us now? And that was a wonderful example of doing that.
Well, thank you, Reverend Susanna, and thank you for having this conversation after presentation. As I was re-listening, I was thinking in some ways this is like so 6 weeks ago COVID because it was recorded about that time ago, and that things changed so quickly, but that also some of these principles remain steady and the same. And I love seeing the ways that churches, including the Garden Church, are continuing to learn and adapt and grow, and that there are some things that are the same 6 weeks ago or 6 months ago, and other things that we're learning and seeing in new ways. And so I think that, I mean, that's a beautiful example of being able to pray through the gates at the Garden Church. I am seeing across the country, both in our Swedenborgian churches and in ecumenical partners of all different denominations, ways that people are being creative. I've seen a lot of feeding programs that either were already in existence and now are needing to adapt, but then there's a greater need. I'm seeing people opening up their gardens. There's labyrinths. We'll have labyrinths, including, the Swedenborg Chapel there in Cambridge now has that kind of offering, and saying, well, what is it that we do have? And I think that's kind of the question that I keep asking with how do we be of use? How do we give? It's like, well, we can't do it the same way we maybe could before, but these resources still exist. So our indoor resources that we're used to, our Sunday morning resources that we're used to aren't there, but what are the resources that we do have and that we can share in that way? And I'd be interested for the people who are listening. I mean, I'm sure that you could all share ways that you're seeing creatively being of use. And then I think I'm seeing a lot of people who are using this time, and particularly these last 3 or 4 weeks, to do the self-examination work around racial justice and doing anti-racism work, and that the pandemic has lifted up that there are inequalities that maybe we weren't seeing, and that this time where we have a little bit more time to do some of that inner regeneration, that inner reflection work of really looking at ourselves and reading and learning and listening, and that we can be of use in that and in sharing those conversations. And there's some wonderful work around Shada Sullivan and Terry Crenshaw and others are doing in the Manifold Angels group in terms of helping to raise our education level here in Convention around that work, and many other ways and expressions. So I know that it's tempting for me to be like, oh, well, we can't do that, so we're going to stop. I guess we just can't serve right now. And instead to say, what do we have? Like, what are the resources we do have right now, and how can we use those?
I'm reminded that, as Swedenborg said, that we are each of us individually church in the smallest form, that goes for us individually as well as our organizations. To what is it that we have to offer? And another question that came up about this time of virtual worship is how can we adapt what we've learned from virtual worship when we go back into our buildings, and how can we bring about changes but also respecting the traditional forms that some people are very attached to?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is obviously different for every congregation and context. One of the things that I'm really encouraging people to notice is, what do you miss? And then what will you miss from virtual worship? I talked a little bit in the talk about this, seeing one another's faces, and how in many of our traditional worship spaces, we see the back of people's heads, and then we see the faces of the people up front. And I'm curious what that, for some, how that might be a change that they want to say, like, well, maybe we want to move things around a little bit, or maybe you don't want to move your pews, but do you turn at some point during worship service, or is there a way to see each other's faces? But I think another piece that I'm often, as I was at the Garden Church, I'm sure that I would guess that Reverend Amanda, Reverend Jonathan get this question a lot too. It's people think that the worship service there is so new and different and creative, and it's really not. It's really just these movements of worship that we're all pretty familiar with. And I think that's something that we're seeing in this time of virtual worship as well, is that we love those patterns and rhythms and ritual of liturgy, and that's good. There's nothing wrong with loving those traditions and patterns, but it's more to ask, are they working in these contexts, and are they accessible in different ways? And so some of the things I'm curious about, and I've been talking to some people who say, I could never hear in church, but I can hear when I'm on Zoom, which makes me think, oh, we have some questions about sound systems in some of our churches. I mean, it sounds really basic and practical, right? But like somebody was not able to access the worship service because of that really practical thing. And I think obviously we'll be adapting and changing and for quite a while, and there'll be hybrid moments and there'll be all sorts of different pieces. But I think really engaging the question of less about that the liturgy has to be all new and different, and more about how does it work in these different contexts, and how can the context actually teach us something about the rhythms of worship we've been doing for a number of years.
It sounds like from what you experienced at the Garden Church that a lot of what came to be happened because you had a lot of participants who offered their creativity in worship and in art, and music, readings. And how can we, if you can share from your experience, how can we encourage people that their contribution to worship is actually not just an opportunity, but it's actually necessary for a community to feel really connected to one another?
Yeah. Well, I think I mean, this might sound kind of simple, but I think it's to do it, to have people to participate, and then to reflect on it. Would often after worship, the Garden Church, after everything was kind of cleaned up, ask the question, gather together anyone who was kind of participated that day, and just say, like, what did you notice? And I noticed that often that when someone was participating, whether it's reading or greeting or whatever it is, that they would notice the group differently. So when you're like being a recipient, we have kind of one set of noticing on, and when we're participating, we have another set of noticing on. And so I think that helping the average congregation member, whatever that is, to see themselves as a participant, and not just because they participated, but because you ask afterwards, what did you notice? And there's a time of self-reflection, and that might be something that you do one-on-one, in this virtual time too, but to be able to help to shift the dynamic of, oh, the clergy person does all the things and the congregation does all the receiving, and maybe the congregation does the volunteer things behind the scenes, and instead to say, we actually make church together. We're all making church together. And part of that is the doing it of it, but part of it's also the reflecting on it, and the noticing afterwards, and the thing that all of us ministers do on a Sunday afternoon or evening. And so how did that go? And what was that like? And that person had a look on their face. What was that about? And to invite people into to the ownership of it in that way, I think can be a piece of encouraging participation, not just for the sake of getting the job done, but because they're making church together means that we are all invested in it in a different way.
I think you've lifted up, at least for me, the thought that it's a difference in perspective from saying I went to worship to saying we worshiped together. And
Oh,
you're lifting up for us that outside the walls of traditionalism, we can find more ways. And you certainly found one at the Garden Church. And to be able to bring us from an I to a we perspective on worship can help us in the larger world to have a we perspective on more things. And so we're at time now. I want to thank you for spending some time to reflect on more of these things that came up with your lecture. It was wonderful, and we're so glad that you were here for this. I want to remind everyone to stay tuned. At 4 o'clock, we'll be having Rebecca Esterson's lecture on the harmonic one, suggestions of divine plurality in the Bible and in Swedenborg. So stay tuned, and thank you for joining us today.
thank you so much.